The wind, sweeping down from the jagged peaks of the Sawtooth Range, carried the bitter chill of early autumn, stirring the dust of Oakhaven into swirling devils that danced along the unpaved main street. Lin Suyin stood outside the false-fronted facade of the Oakhaven Mercantile, her posture rigidly straight despite the gnawing hunger in her stomach and the exhaustion settling deep into her bones. Her husband, Shen, had been dead for exactly 42 days, taken by a sudden fever that had swept through the Chinese encampment across Bitter Creek. Shen had been a meticulous man, a merchant of modest means who had traded imported teas and herbal remedies to the miners and railway workers, but his sudden passing had left Suyin adrift in a town that viewed her with a mixture of suspicion and outright hostility. She wore a high-collared dress of dark blue cotton, faded from countless washings, but completely free of dust or wrinkles, her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot at the nape of her neck. Her hands, calloused from years of relentless labor but steady and composed, rested lightly clasped in front of her. She was waiting for Mr. Horace Blackwood, the owner of the Mercantile and the president of the Oakhaven Bank, a man whose shadow seemed to fall over every transaction and property deed within a 50-mile radius. Mr. Blackwood stepped out onto the wooden boardwalk, his polished boots striking the planks with a heavy, authoritative thud that demanded the attention of anyone within earshot. He was a man of substantial girth, dressed in a tailored broadcloth suit that seemed entirely out of place amidst the rough canvas and worn leather of the frontier town. His face was round and perpetually flushed, his small pale eyes darting over Suyin with a predatory calculation that made her skin crawl, though she permitted no emotion to register on her stoic features. A small crowd of onlookers had begun to gather, drawn by the scent of impending misfortune, like crows to a fresh carcass. There was Mrs. Martha Higgins, the proprietor of the local boarding house, whose normally sympathetic face was drawn tight with nervous apprehension, and a smattering of off-duty ranch hands who chewed tobacco and muttered among themselves. Blackwood withdrew a gold pocket watch, snapped it open, checked the time with an exaggerated sigh, and then looked down his fleshy nose at the widow standing in the dust. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth and artificially loud, designed to carry across the street and ensure that the entire town witnessed the demonstration of his power. He informed Suyin, with a veneer of superficial regret that fooled absolutely no one, that her late husband had left behind a significant ledger of unpaid debts that far exceeded the meager value of the ramshackle cabin they had occupied across the creek. Suyin knew this to be a lie. Shen had kept his own ledgers written in precise calligraphy, recording every ounce of tea sold and every penny owed or paid. They owed no man anything, least of all the grasping merchant who now stood before her waving a piece of parchment filled with fraudulent figures. However, Shen's ledgers had mysteriously vanished from their cabin on the night of his funeral, a theft Suyin had reported to the town sheriff, only to be met with a dismissive shrug and a vague promise to look into the matter when time permitted. Suyin spoke, her English precise, formal, and heavily accented, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with Blackwood's bombastic theatrics. She stated simply that her husband was a man of honor who did not purchase on credit, and that the document Mr. Blackwood held was a fabrication, a falsehood designed to steal the last remnants of her livelihood. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. It was one thing for a destitute widow to plead for mercy. It was entirely another for an outsider, a Chinese woman of no standing, to publicly accuse the town's most prominent citizen of fraud. Blackwood's flush deepened from pink to an angry mottled crimson. The superficial politeness vanished, replaced by a sneering cruelty. He took a step forward, his bulk looming over her, and declared that she had until sundown to vacate the cabin across the creek, or he would have the sheriff forcibly remove her and seize whatever pathetic belongings she still possessed to settle the alleged account. He added, his voice dripping with condescension, that perhaps she could find employment in one of the less reputable establishments on the edge of town. As it seemed, she had no other marketable skills. Silas Thorne had been standing in the deep shade of the livery stable awning, a silent observer to the unfolding drama. Silas was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded Oakhaven, tall and lean, his face weathered by years of sun and wind into a mask of stoic endurance. He was the owner of the Ironwood, a sprawling cattle ranch nestled in the foothills 10 miles north of town, a man who commanded respect not through wealth or loud declarations, but through a reputation for unyielding fairness and a quiet, dangerous competence. Silas had lived a solitary existence for the past 6 years, ever since a winter sickness had taken his wife Sarah. After her death, he had built high fences around his heart and his property, retreating into the relentless, methodical rhythm of ranch work, speaking only when necessary and avoiding the social entanglements of Oakhaven whenever possible. But he possessed a deeply ingrained sense of justice, a quiet compass that pointed true north, and the sight of Horace Blackwood bullying a defenseless widow turned his stomach. He stepped out from the shadow of the awning, his spurs jingling faintly with each deliberate step, the sound cutting through the murmurs of the crowd and bringing a sudden tense silence to the street. Silas did not hurry. He walked with the slow, measured gait of a man who owned the ground beneath his boots. The crowd parted, instinctively giving him a wide berth. Blackwood, noticing the shift in the atmosphere, turned and watched Silas approach, his arrogant sneer faltering slightly, replaced by a flicker of wary calculation. Silas ignored the banker entirely. He stopped a few feet from Suyin, his pale blue eyes studying her face. He saw the exhaustion, the shadows of grief beneath her dark eyes, but he also saw the unbending steel in her spine and the fierce, quiet intelligence that radiated from her. She did not shrink from his gaze, meeting it with a steady, searching look of her own. Silas removed his battered Stetson, the gesture a sign of respect that caused another ripple of surprised whispers among the townsfolk. He did not offer empty condolences or patronizing pity. Grief moved like weather, he knew. It was a storm that had to be endured, not a problem that could be fixed with soft words. Instead, he made a practical, transactional offer, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried easily in the quiet street. He stated that he had a ranch 10 miles north, the Ironwood. He stated that his ledgers were a disorganized mess. His house was suffering from years of neglect, and his hands were too busy with the cattle to properly maintain the homestead. He looked directly into Suyin's eyes and offered her a position. He needed a bookkeeper and a housekeeper. The pay would be fair, room and board would be provided, and she would answer to no one but him. He framed the offer not as charity, but as a mutually beneficial arrangement, a simple exchange of labor for sanctuary. Suyin considered the tall, quiet man before her. She saw the dust on his coat, the deep lines etched around his eyes, and the absolute sincerity in his posture. She recognized the nature of the offer. It was a lifeline thrown into a raging river, but it was a lifeline made of rough hemp, not silk. It required work, competence, and a willingness to step into the unknown. She glanced briefly at the smirking face of Horace Blackwood, then back to the steady, unreadable face of Silas Thorne. She gave a single crisp nod of her head. She accepted the position, stating that she would require an hour to gather her belongings from the cabin across the creek. Silas nodded in return, replacing his hat. He told her he would wait with his wagon by the livery. He then turned his gaze to Blackwood, his pale eyes narrowing slightly, the look entirely devoid of warmth. He suggested in a tone that brokered no argument that Mr. Blackwood should consider the widow's alleged debt settled, unless he wished to discuss the matter further with Silas personally. Blackwood, recognizing a battle he could not win through bluster, swallowed hard, muttered something unintelligible about proper documentation, and retreated hastily into the safety of his mercantile. The journey to the Ironwood Ranch was undertaken in profound silence. The buckboard wagon rattled and swayed over the rutted dirt road, the two draft horses pulling with a steady, rhythmic plodding. Suyin sat on the wooden bench beside Silas, her meagre possessions contained within a single battered canvas trunk in the bed of the wagon. She watched the landscape change from the dusty, scrub-covered flats of the valley floor to the rolling, timbered foothills where the ranch was situated. The silence between them was not oppressive. Rather, it was the cautious, evaluating silence of two solitary creatures sharing a confined space. Silas kept his eyes on the road, his large calloused hands holding the leather reins with a loose, expert grip. Occasionally he would point out a landmark, a jagged rock formation, a grove of ancient cottonwoods marking a hidden spring, but he offered no small talk, and Suyin asked no frivolous questions. She appreciated the quiet. It allowed her to gather her fractured thoughts, to mourn the life she had just been forced to abandon, and to mentally prepare for the tasks ahead. The Ironwood ranch house sat in a shallow valley, flanked by dense stands of the resilient timber that gave the property its name. It was a substantial structure of peeled logs and river stone, built to withstand the brutal winters, but it bore the unmistakable signs of long-term neglect. The porch steps were sagging, the windows were coated in a layer of grime that obscured the fading afternoon light, and the surrounding yard was overgrown with weeds. Inside, the situation was even more dire. The air was stale, smelling of cold wood ashes, old coffee and dust. The furniture was sturdy but covered in a thick layer of grit, and the kitchen was a chaotic jumble of unwashed cast-iron pans and half-empty sacks of provisions. In the corner of the main room sat a heavy oak desk, completely submerged beneath a small mountain of crumpled receipts, half-filled ledger books, and loose scraps of paper. Silas stood in the doorway, suddenly acutely aware of the squalor he had allowed himself to live in. He offered a gruff, awkward apology for the state of the place, stating that he spent most of his time out on the range. Suyin did not express dismay. She simply removed her shawl, folded it neatly, and placed it on a relatively clean chair. She surveyed the room with the methodical, calculating eye of a general assessing a battlefield. She asked Silas to show her to her quarters, requested a bucket, some lye soap, and a supply of clean water, and then immediately set to work. Over the next several days, a quiet but profound transformation occurred within the walls of the Ironwood ranch house. Suyin attacked the grime with a relentless, focused energy. She scrubbed the wide plank floors until the wood grain shone, washed the windows until the sunlight poured into the rooms in golden, unobstructed beams, and reorganized the kitchen into a model of efficiency. The stale scent of neglect was banished, replaced by the warm, comforting aromas of baking bread, roasting meats, and the sharp, clean scent of lemon oil. Silas, returning from the pastures at dusk, found himself pausing on the porch, disoriented by the inviting glow of lamplight spilling from the clean windows. The true measure of her competence, however, was demonstrated at the oak desk. Suyin spent her evenings sitting by the light of a kerosene lamp, carefully untangling the chaotic mess of Silas's financial record. She possessed a brilliant mathematical mind, trained by her late husband in the complex art of commerce and accounting. She smoothed out the crumpled receipts, deciphered Silas's hasty, illegible scrawls, and began transferring the data into a fresh, pristine ledger. She worked with an abacus she had brought in her trunk, the wooden beads clicking with a rapid, rhythmic precision that became the evening soundtrack of the house. Within a week, she presented Silas with a clear, concise summary of his financial standing. She had identified outstanding payments he was owed from cattle buyers in Chicago, discovered several recurring overcharges from the Oakhaven Mercantile, and projected a budget for the upcoming winter that would allow him to purchase additional feed and hire 2 more seasonal hands. Silas sat in his armchair, staring at the neatly columned pages. He was a man who understood cattle, weather, the hard labor of the land, but numbers had always been a frustrating mystery to him. He listened as Suyin explained the figures, her voice calm and authoritative, her finger tracing the lines of ink. He felt a profound, quiet respect taking root within him. He realized that he had not simply hired a housekeeper. He had acquired a partner of formidable intelligence and capability. He looked up from the ledger, meeting her dark eyes, and offered a single understated word of praise, stating that she had done fine work. It was a meager compliment by most standards, but Suyin saw the genuine admiration in his face and felt a small, unfamiliar spark of pride warm her chest. The arrangement they had forged out of desperation was evolving into something far more substantial, built on a foundation of mutual reliance and earned respect. Their daily interactions remained formal, governed by a careful, unspoken protocol. She addressed him as Mr. Thorne. He called her Mrs. Suyin, yet a comfortable rhythm developed between them. They shared their meals in the kitchen, eating the hearty, flavorful dishes Suyin prepared: stews, rich with root vegetables, roasted fowl seasoned with herbs she had discovered growing wild near the creek, and delicate steamed dumplings that Silas found strangely addictive. The silence that stretched between them during these meals was no longer cautious. It was a companionable quiet, the silence of two people who did not feel the need to fill the air with meaningless chatter. Silas found himself anticipating the end of the day, looking forward to the moment he could unbuckle his gun belt, wash the dust from his face, and step into the warm, ordered sanctuary of his home. He began to notice small details about her: the graceful, efficient way she moved, the intense concentration that furrowed her brow when she was calculating numbers, and the rare, fleeting smile that touched the corners of her mouth when one of the barn cats rubbed against her ankles. In town, however, the collective judgment of Oakhaven was festering. The frontier was a place of rigid, unwritten social codes, and the arrangement at the Ironwood Ranch violated several of them. The townspeople, fueled by the malicious whispers of Horace Blackwood, began to gossip. They speculated loudly about the true nature of the relationship between the solitary white rancher and the Chinese widow. In the mercantile, Mrs. Higgins would lean over the counter, exchanging hushed, scandalized tones with the banker's wife, wondering aloud how a respectable man like Silas Thorne could allow such an improper situation to continue under his roof. Blackwood fanned these flames with deliberate, calculated malice. He had not forgotten the public humiliation he had suffered at Silas's hands, and his greed was a restless, hungry thing. The Ironwood Ranch possessed the most reliable year-round water source in the valley, a strategic asset Blackwood had long coveted. He saw the town's growing disapproval as a weapon he could wield to pry the property from Silas's grasp. Blackwood began his campaign methodically. He used his influence to pressure the local freight company to delay shipments of supplies destined for the Ironwood. He subtly encouraged the seasonal ranch hands who frequented the town's saloons to seek employment elsewhere, spreading rumors that Silas was going soft in the head and that the ranch was destined for ruin. Finally, he convened a private meeting of the Oakhaven Bank's board of directors, men who owed their livelihoods to his patronage. He argued, with superficial piety, that Silas Thorne's flagrant disregard for the moral standards of the community made him a high-risk borrower. He proposed that the bank call in the substantial note Silas had taken out 3 years prior to purchase a neighboring parcel of grazing land, citing an obscure clause in the contract regarding the maintenance of a respectable reputation. The board, cowed by Blackwood's authority, unanimously agreed. The threat arrived at the Ironwood on a Tuesday afternoon, carried by the town sheriff, Elias Vance. Vance was a tired man who generally preferred to look the other way when trouble brewed, but he could not ignore a direct order from the bank. He rode into the yard, looking deeply uncomfortable, and handed Silas the formal notice of foreclosure. Silas stood on the porch, his jaw tight, his pale eyes scanning the legal document. Suyin stood a few paces behind him, a damp dish towel clutched in her hands, her face unreadable. Vance mumbled an apology, stating that it was just business, that the bank was demanding payment in full within 30 days, an amount Silas could not possibly raise until after the autumn cattle drive. Silas simply folded the paper, slipped it into his shirt pocket, and told the sheriff to ride clear of his property. As Vance rode away, Silas turned to Suyin. He did not curse or shout. He simply stated the facts. Blackwood was trying to force a sale, using the town's prejudice as a lever. Suyin did not panic. She returned to the kitchen, laid the dish towel aside, and walked to the oak desk. She pulled out the ledgers, both the new one she had created and the old, disorganized books she had deciphered. She worked late into the night, the abacus clicking with a furious, relentless intensity. She was searching for a pattern, a thread she could pull, to unravel Blackwood's carefully constructed facade of respectability. She remembered the recurring overcharges she had found earlier, the inflated prices for salt and wire that Silas had unknowingly paid. She began cross-referencing these charges with the dates of Silas's bank deposits, looking for discrepancies in the interest calculations. By dawn her eyes were burning and her fingers ached, but she had found it. Blackwood was not merely overcharging at the mercantile. He was systematically skimming funds from the bank accounts of his patrons, manipulating the interest rates on loans, and quietly transferring the stolen capital into private holdings under dummy names. It was a complex, paper-based theft, invisible to the illiterate ranchers and trusting townsfolk, but glaringly obvious to a trained bookkeeper. She presented her findings to Silas over breakfast. She explained the mechanism of the fraud, showing him the specific pages where the numbers had been altered. Silas listened, his expression hardening into a mask of cold, focused anger. He realized that Blackwood was not just a greedy opportunist, he was a parasite, bleeding the entire community dry. Silas asked if she was certain if the evidence in the ledgers would hold up under scrutiny. Suyin met his gaze, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, quiet certainty. She stated that numbers, unlike men, did not lie. If the federal bank examiner in the territorial capital were to see these ledgers, Horace Blackwood would spend the rest of his life in a territorial prison. Silas nodded slowly. They had a weapon, a means to fight back, but they both knew that cornering a desperate man was a dangerous proposition. Blackwood, however, did not wait to be cornered. He was a coward at heart, preferring to strike from the shadows. He realized that legal maneuvering might take too long, and he wanted the ironwood broken and compliant immediately. He hired 3 drifters, rough men who possessed no loyalty and asked no questions, paying them a sum of gold to deliver a message that Silas Thorne could not ignore. Crucible moment arrived on a moonless night, the wind howling down from the mountains, masking the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Silas was awakened by the frantic, terrified whinnying of the horses in the main barn. He threw off his blankets, grabbed his Winchester rifle, and rushed out onto the porch. The night sky to the east was glowing with an angry, unnatural orange light. Dry grass near the winter hay stalls had been set ablaze, and the fire, driven by the wind, was racing toward the large wooden barn where the prime breeding stock was stalled. Silas sprinted across the yard, shouting for Suyin to stay in the house. He threw open the heavy barn doors, met by a wall of blistering heat and thick, choking smoke. The horses were panicked, kicking at their stalls, their eyes wide with terror. Silas tied his neckerchief over his face and plunged into the smoke, trying to reach the halters of the massive draft horses. He was struggling to calm a terrified stallion when he saw her. Suyin had not stayed in the house. She had emerged, wearing a heavy canvas coat, a bucket of water in each hand. She did not waste time screaming or panicking. She moved with a terrifying, purposeful calm. She threw the water onto the burning wall nearest the stalls, temporarily beating back the flames, and then grabbed a heavy wool blanket, soaked it in the water trough, and threw it over the head of a panicked mare, blinding the animal to the flames and allowing Silas to lead it to safety. They worked together in a desperate, frantic choreography, communicating through gestures and shouted commands, barely audible over the roar of the fire. Zuyin darted back and forth between the trough and the flames, her face smeared with soot, her hands blistered by the heat, but she did not falter. She was a force of nature, driven by a fierce determination to protect the home she had helped rebuild. As Silas led the last horse out into the cool night air, the roof of the barn groaned and collapsed inward in a shower of sparks and flaming timbers. Silas dropped the lead rope and spun around, his heart seizing in his chest. He could not see Suyin. He screamed her name, a raw, desperate sound that tore at his throat, plunging back toward the burning structure. He found her near the pump, coughing violently, clutching a heavy metal strongbox to her chest. It was the box that contained the ledgers, the evidence of Blackwood's fraud. She had run back into the house while he was saving the horses to ensure their only weapon was secure. Silas dropped to his knees beside her, his large hands trembling as he reached out to her. He did not think about propriety or the boundaries they had maintained. He grabbed her shoulders, pulling her away from the heat, his hands running frantically over her arms and face, checking for severe burns. His voice was a harsh, ragged whisper as he asked if she was injured. Suyin, still coughing, shook her head, leaning briefly into the solid, comforting strength of his grip. For a long moment they knelt together in the dirt, the fire raging behind them, the smell of smoke and fear hanging heavy in the air. In the immediate aftermath, as they sat on the porch watching the embers die down, barriers between them finally crumbled. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a profound, aching vulnerability. Silas, staring at his soot-stained hands, spoke for the first time about his wife, Sarah. He spoke of the winter she died, the crushing, suffocating weight of the grief that had turned his heart to stone. The years he had spent building high fences to ensure he would never have to feel that kind of pain again. His voice was low, halting, stripped of its usual stoicism. Suyin listened quietly, her own hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea. When he finished, she spoke of Cantong, of the father who had taught her mathematics, and of the terrifying journey across the ocean. She spoke of Shen, of his kindness, and the cold, terrifying reality of being left utterly alone in a hostile world. They sat in the darkness, sharing the heavy burdens of their pasts, the shared confession forging a bond deeper and stronger than any formal arrangement. The morning dawned grey and smelling of ash. Silas and Suyin did not waste time mourning the lost barn. They hitched the team to the wagon, placed the metal strongbox on the seat between them, and drove into Oakhaven. The town was awake, the streets bustling with morning activity. Silas drove the wagon directly to the Oakhaven bank, pulling the team to a halt with a sharp command. He stepped down, retrieved the strongbox, and offered his hand to Suyin. She took it, her grip firm and steady, and they walked up the steps together. They did not go to the teller's cage. They walked directly into the spacious, opulent office of Horace Blackwood. Blackwood was sitting behind his mahogany desk, a smug, satisfied expression on his face, likely expecting Silas to come begging for an extension after the disaster of the previous night. The smugness vanished the moment he saw the cold, murderous intent in Silas's eyes and the calm, unwavering resolve in Suyin's posture. Silas slammed the strongbox onto the mahogany desk, the heavy metal gouging the polished wood. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying clarity. He informed Blackwood that the fire had been a mistake, a cowardly act that had only accelerated his ruin. Suyin stepped forward, opening the box and withdrawing the ledgers. She opened the books, placing them directly in front of the banker. In her precise, formal English, she detailed the exact nature of the fraud, pointing out the altered figures, the dummy accounts, the systematic theft from the townspeople of Oakhaven. She informed him that she had drafted a letter detailing these findings, addressed to the federal bank examiner, and that a copy was currently sitting in the saddlebags of a trusted ranch hand, ready to ride for the telegraph office in the territorial capital, if they did not return by noon. Blackwood's face drained of color, turning a sickly, pasty white. The bombastic tyrant evaporated, replaced by a trembling, pathetic coward. He stammered, attempting to offer bribes, excuses, and desperate deals, but Silas cut him off. Silas demanded that the foreclosure notice on the ironwood be immediately rescinded and the original note marked as paid in full, a small compensation for the destruction of his barn. Furthermore, he demanded the Blackwood step down from the bank board and sell the mercantile, leaving Oakhaven permanently before the end of the month. If he refused, the ledgers would go to the federal examiner, and the ranchers he had been stealing from would likely hang him from the nearest cottonwood tree before the marshals even arrived. Blackwood, staring at the damning numbers meticulously recorded in Suyin's neat calligraphy, realized he was utterly defeated. With shaking hands, he signed the documents Silas presented, his empire crumbling into dust beneath the combined weight of Silas's physical presence and Suyin's intellectual brilliance. The ride back to the ironwood was vastly different from their first journey. The heavy oppressive silence of caution had been replaced by the comfortable, golden silence of victory and mutual understanding. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm light over the foothills. Silas let the horses set their own pace, his hands relaxed on the reins. He glanced sideways at Suyin. She was looking out over the valley, a look of profound peace settling over her features. The soot had been washed from her face, and she looked radiant, strong, and undeniably beautiful in the harsh frontier light. Silas knew that he could not return to the solitary existence he had led before she arrived. The high fences he had built were gone, burned away by the fire and dismantled by the quiet, steady presence of the woman sitting beside him. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the crest of a hill overlooking the ranch. The blackened ruins of the barn were a scar on the landscape, but the house stood strong and clean, a testament to the life they had built within it. Silas turned to Suyin, removing his hat. He was not a man of poetry or grand, passionate speeches. He spoke plainly, stating facts as he saw them. He told her that she had saved his ranch, his livelihood, and quite possibly his life. He told her that the arrangement they had made, the transactional exchange of labor for shelter, was no longer sufficient. He looked deeply into her dark eyes, his own pale eyes filled with an earnest, unwavering sincerity. He asked her to stay at the ironwood, not as a bookkeeper and not as a housekeeper. He asked her to stay as his wife, as an equal partner in everything he owned and everything he hoped to build. It was a practical proposal devoid of flowery romance, but it carried the weight of a lifelong commitment, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and earned respect. Suyin looked at the man who had offered her a lifeline when the world had turned its back on her. She saw his integrity, his quiet strength, and the deep, abiding affection he held for her. An affection he expressed not in words, but in the respectful way he listened to her, the way he valued her mind, and the way he had stood beside her against the town's prejudice. She realized that she had found a place where her competence was not merely utilized, but cherished. She did not hesitate. She reached out her small calloused hand, covering his large rough one, resting on the wooden bench. She smiled, a genuine radiant expression that transformed her face, and offered a single precise word of acceptance. She said, yes. 14 months later, the Ironwood Ranch was unrecognizable from the neglected property it had once been. A new barn, larger and sturdier than the last, stood proudly in the yard, filled with the scent of fresh hay and the nickering of healthy horses. Behind the house, a massive garden flourished, a testament to Suyin's relentless labor and deep knowledge of the soil, yielding a bounty of vegetables and herbs that sustained them through the long winters. The ledgers on the oak desk were perfectly balanced, reflecting a prosperity that was the envy of the valley. The town of Oakhaven, having witnessed the spectacular downfall of Horace Blackwood, and realizing the undeniable competence of the couple at the ironwood, had undergone a slow but complete reversal of opinion. Silas Thorne and his wife, Suyin, were now regarded with a grudging, deeply ingrained respect, their business sought after, and their credit unquestioned. The sun was sinking below the jagged peaks of the Sawtooth Range, painting the sky in vibrant strokes of fading gold, bruised purple, and deep crimson. Silas and Suyin sat side by side on the sturdy, rebuilt porch of the ranch house. The evening air was cool, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and impending frost. Silas sat in a heavy wooden rocking chair, a cup of steaming tea, brewed perfectly from leaves Suyin had specially ordered from San Francisco, resting in his hand. He watched a young foal, born just weeks prior, capering clumsily in the pasture near the creek. He felt a profound, quiet contentment settling deep into his bones, a feeling he had once believed was lost to him forever. Suyin sat beside him, a basket of mending in her lap, her needle moving with a rhythmic, practiced efficiency. She paused in her work, looking up from the fabric to watch the fading light play across the landscape. She felt the solid, reassuring presence of her husband beside her, the man who had crossed the bitter creek of prejudice and isolation to offer her a future. She leaned slightly, her shoulder resting comfortably against his arm, a simple, non-passionate gesture of profound connection. Silas shifted his weight, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer against the evening chill. They did not speak. There was no need for words. The thriving ranch, the balanced ledgers, and the comfortable, unbroken silence that stretched between them were all the testimony required to prove the strength of the partnership they had forged. They sat together as the last light faded, two solitary souls who had weathered the storms of grief and hardship, looking out over the peaceful domain they had earned, entirely secure in the shared future that lay ahead.